The year 1462 since the Nativity of Christ. A sweltering, impenetrable summer night enveloped the plains of Wallachia, concealing within its inky womb an army the likes of which these lands had never before seen. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, the triumphant, whose name made kings and emperors tremble, led his janissaries and sipahis towards the heart of the rebellious principality, the city of Targoviste. The air was heavy, saturated with the smells of dust, horse sweat, and an almost imperceptible, unsettling premonition of something monstrous. None of the Ottoman warriors, intoxicated by a string of victories, yet knew that on this very night, in this accursed land, their eyes would behold a sight capable of shaking even the most hardened hearts. Dawn, slowly and reluctantly dispelling the darkness, revealed to them something surpassing the most hideous nightmares. Before the walls of Targoviste, on a vast field, stretched a forest not of trees, but of stakes, and on each of the thousands of these sharpened logs, the body of an Ottoman prisoner writhed in its death throes, or had already frozen in silent horror. This was the response of the Wallachian voivode, Vlad, nicknamed Dracula, to the invasion of the mighty Port. A silent yet deafening message, written in blood and fear. It was here, on this field of death, that the threads of fate intertwined into such a tight knot that its echo would resound through the ages, giving birth to legends that chill the blood in one's veins. And at the center of this vortex stood he, Vlad Tepes, the warrior prince, the executioner prince, whose name became synonymous with inhuman cruelty and a desperate struggle for a patch of land, for the right to call oneself free. Our story is about him, about his time, his deeds, his legacy, which extends far beyond the bloody fields of Wallachia, penetrating the darkest corners of human imagination. Prepare for a long and deep immersion into a world of intrigue, betrayal, great battles, and blood-curdling legends. We will trace his path from birth to his mysterious death, attempt to understand the motives behind his actions, and separate historical truth from the sinister myth that has enveloped his name in a dense shroud. This is the story of Vlad Tepes, Dracula, voivode of Wallachia. The 15th century, an era of great upheavals and cardinal changes, a time when the old world was crumbling under the onslaught of new forces, and borders were being redrawn on the map of Europe. Entire states were born and perished. Southeastern Europe, the Balkan Peninsula, represented a particularly turbulent cauldron where the interests of powerful states intertwined, where the Christian world desperately tried to contain the inexorable expansion of a new, young, and aggressive force, the Ottoman Empire. These lands, once famed for their ancient cultures and proud kingdoms, had now become an arena of continuous wars, political intrigues, and religious confrontation. The Ottoman threat loomed over the Balkans like a thundercloud, ready to burst forth with a rain of fire. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to Sultan Mehmed II, nicknamed Fatih, meaning the conqueror, the Byzantine Empire, the thousand-year bastion of orthodoxy and heir to Rome, ceased to exist. This event had colossal psychological and geopolitical consequences for the entire Christian world. Fear of the Ottomans, whom many considered a scourge of God, a punishing hand for the sins of Christians, paralyzed the will of some rulers and incited others to desperate resistance. The Ottoman war machine, well-oiled and merciless, seemed invincible. The janissaries, elite infantrymen raised in strictest discipline and loyalty to the Sultan, and the sipahis, heavy cavalry, formed the core of an army capable of crushing any opponent. Their tactics, based on swift maneuvers, the use of artillery, and vast numbers, brought victory after victory. Balkan peoples, Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, Albanians, one after another fell under Ottoman rule, losing their independence and sometimes their cultural identity. In this seething cauldron lay Wallachia, a small principality, wedged between mighty Hungary to the north and west, the Ottoman Empire whose borders were steadily advancing from the south, and the Principality of Moldavia to the east. Wallachia's geographical position, located in the lower Danube region at the crossroads of important trade routes, made it a coveted prize for all its neighbors and simultaneously doomed it to a constant struggle for survival. The lands of Wallachia were fertile, rich in forests and pastures, which attracted conquerors. Its population, predominantly Orthodox Christian and speaking a Romance language, considered themselves heirs of Roman colonists and Dacians, priding themselves on their history and culture. However, maintaining independence in such conditions was incredibly difficult. Wallachian voivodes were forced to maneuver between powerful neighbors, pay tribute sometimes to one, sometimes to another, and conclude alliances that often proved short-lived and treacherous. The internal situation in Wallachia also did not contribute to stability. The principality was torn by feudal strife, power struggles between various boyar factions. The boyars, large landowners, possessed enormous influence, their own military forces, and often placed their narrow clan interests above those of the state. They could elevate a favored candidate to the throne or overthrow an unfavored one, often resorting to the help of external forces, Hungarians or Ottomans. The voivode's throne was precarious, and every ruler had to constantly prove his right to power, relying either on the strength of his own sword or on the support of a powerful patron. Frequent changes of rulers, conspiracies, and assassinations were all commonplace in the political life of 15th-century Wallachia. This instability weakened the principality from within, making it even more vulnerable to external threats. Wallachia's neighbors also played a key role in its fate. The Kingdom of Hungary, one of the largest and strongest states in Central Europe, considered Wallachia its sphere of influence and Wallachian voivodes its vassals. Hungarian kings often interfered in the principality's internal affairs, supporting various claimants to the throne, and used Wallachia as a buffer state against the Ottomans. John Hunyadi, the famous Hungarian military commander and regent of the kingdom, was one of the key figures in the region, an organizer of many anti-Ottoman campaigns, and his policy directly influenced the fate of Wallachia and its rulers, including Vlad Tepes. The Principality of Moldavia, bordering Wallachia to the east, also strove to maintain its independence, maneuvering between Poland, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Relations between Wallachia and Moldavia were complex. Periods of alliance alternated with conflicts, often related to dynastic disputes or struggles for border territories. The outstanding Moldavian voivode Stephen the Great, or Stefan cel Mare, a contemporary of Vlad Tepes, would become one of the most important figures in Vlad's later biography. The Polish-Lithuanian state, stretching over vast territories north of Wallachia, also had its interests in the region, although its influence on Wallachian affairs was less direct than that of Hungary or the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, Polish kings closely watched the situation in the Balkans and occasionally intervened, seeking to weaken their competitors. Such was the world into which Vlad Tepes was to arrive. A cruel, dangerous world, full of challenges and threats. A world where the right of the strong was valued above any treaties, where betrayal was commonplace and human life was cheap. To survive and rule in such a world required not only intelligence and cunning, but also an iron will, a readiness to resort to extreme measures, and the ability to inspire fear in both enemies and one's own subjects. It was these qualities that the future voivode of Wallachia, whose name would forever remain in history, was destined to develop. To understand the personality and motives of Vlad Tepes, it is necessary to turn to his roots, to the history of his lineage, the Basarab dynasty, which ruled Wallachia for many centuries. This dynasty, founded by the legendary Basarab in the early 14th century, gave Wallachia a whole pleiad of brilliant but often controversial rulers. Their history is a succession of glorious victories and bitter defeats, periods of flourishing and deep decline, struggles for independence, and forced submission to stronger neighbors. The blood of the Basarabs was hot, and their tempers untamed. Many of them were talented military commanders and skilled diplomats, but also cruel tyrants who stopped at nothing to retain power. The Basarab dynasty itself eventually split into two warring branches, the dynasty and the Draculest. Vlad Tepes belonged to the Draculest branch, founded by his grandfather, Mircea the Elder, known as Mircea cel Bătrân. Mircea the Elder, who ruled Wallachia at the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries, is considered one of the greatest voivodes in the country's history. He successfully resisted Ottoman expansion, won several victories over the Turks, strengthened central authority, and expanded the principality's territory. His long and relatively stable reign became a golden age for Wallachia. However, after his death, the struggle for the throne between his numerous descendants and representatives of the dynasty clan resumed with renewed vigor, plunging the country into the chaos of internecine strife. Vlad Tepes' father was Vlad II, who went down in history with the nickname Dracula. This nickname, which later became fatal for his son and the entire family, has an interesting origin. In 1431, Vlad the Impaler was admitted to the elite knightly Order of the Dragon, founded by Sigismund of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor, who was also King of Hungary. The order's purpose was to defend Christianity against infidels, primarily the Ottomans. Members of the order, among whom were monarchs and the noblest magnates of Europe, wore a medallion around their necks depicting a dragon defeating a hydra, or, according to other versions, a dragon biting its own tail, forming a ring, a symbol of eternity and self-sacrifice. Vlad II, proud of his membership in the order, began to mint coins with the image of a dragon and use it as his personal symbol. In the Romanian language, the word drac means devil, and iul is an article. Thus, Dracul can be translated as the dragon, or by a later and negative connotation, the devil. Vlad II himself probably invested the first heroic meaning in this nickname, associated with the fight against the enemies of Christianity. The policy of Vlad II Dracul was complex and contradictory. He was forced to maneuver between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, trying to preserve Wallachia's independence. He swore allegiance to the Hungarian king, but at the same time paid tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. Such a dual policy was typical for many Balkan rulers of that time, but it also often led to accusations of betrayal and indecision. Vlad II tried to strengthen his power within the country, struggling with rebellious boyars, but his reign was unstable, interrupted by exiles and returns to the throne. He was married several times and had several sons by different wives, among them Mircea II, Vlad, the future Tepes, and Radu, nicknamed the Handsome, or Cel Frumos. The nickname Dracul, born by his father, was passed on to his sons. Vlad III became known as Dracula, in Romanian Draculea, meaning son of the dragon or son of the devil. If his father could still associate himself with the noble dragon defender, for his son, whose reputation was far more sinister, the second connotation, son of the devil, proved more enduring, especially outside Wallachia. This nickname, initially having no connection to vampirism, would play a key role in the posthumous transformation of Vlad Tepes' image. Another famous nickname of Vlad III, Tepes, in Romanian, appeared after his death and translates as the Impaler. It directly points to the favorite method of execution that Vlad widely practiced during his reign. Thus, his two most famous names, Dracula and Tepes, reflect different facets of his personality and historical legacy. The first is linked to his lineage and his father's order, the second to his cruelty and methods of rule. The struggle for power, betrayal, and violence, were an integral part of the Draculist family's life. From an early age, Vlad Tepes learned that in this world, one could rely only on oneself and the strength of one's weapon. The fate of his father, Vlad II Dracula, and his older brother Mircea II would become a harsh lesson for him and largely predetermine his own path. The exact date and place of Vlad III Dracula's birth are debated among historians, but the period between 1428 and 1431 is considered most likely. His birthplace is often cited as the town of Sighișoara in Transylvania, where his father, Vlad II Dracula, lived in exile and owned a house. Sighișoara, a picturesque medieval town with powerful fortress walls and towers, founded by German colonists known as Saxons, still retains the atmosphere of that harsh era. If Vlad was indeed born there, his first impressions were associated with stone strongholds, the clang of weapons, and a constant sense of danger emanating from both external enemies and internal intrigues. Vlad's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of political instability, and his father's constant struggle for the Wallachian throne. He witnessed how alliances changed, how yesterday's friends became enemies, and how easily blood was shed in the fight for power. These early impressions undoubtedly left an imprint on his character, making him suspicious, secretive, and prepared for any surprises. He received an education befitting a prince's son. He learned literacy, foreign languages, probably Latin, German, Hungarian, military arts, horsemanship, and fencing. However, his main school was life itself, full of dangers and trials. A key event that largely shaped the personality of the future Tepes was his time as a hostage to the Ottoman Sultan. In 1442, though according to other data this happened somewhat later, Vlad II Dracula, seeking to prove his loyalty to the Ottoman Empire and secure its support in the struggle for the throne, was forced to send two of his sons, young Vlad, who was about 11 to 13 years old, and his younger brother Radu, to the court of Sultan Murad II in Adrianople, or Edirne, then the Ottoman capital. The practice of taking children of vassal rulers hostage was widespread in the Ottoman Empire. This guaranteed their father's loyalty and allowed the Ottomans to raise future rulers in a spirit of devotion to the Porte, as well as to familiarize them with Ottoman culture, language, and customs. The years Vlad and Radu spent in Ottoman captivity. Effectively, it was an honorable hostage situation, but with a constant threat to their lives in case of their father's disloyalty, had an immense, though very different, influence on them. Radu, distinguished by his beauty and gentler nature, managed to adapt to life at the Ottoman court. He converted to Islam, though this is disputed by some historians, became a favorite of the heir to the throne, the future Sultan Mehmed II, and received the nickname Cel Frumos, the Handsome. His fate became closely linked with the Ottomans, and he would later become their puppet on the Wallachian throne, and the main opponent of his brother Vlad. Vlad, on the other hand, perceived the years of hostage-taking as a humiliation and a severe trial. He witnessed Ottoman power, saw their military organization, well-oiled system of governance, but also their cruelty, cunning, and contempt for infidels. He studied the Turkish language, the Quran, Ottoman laws, and military affairs. Perhaps it was there that he first saw execution by impalement, which was common among the Ottomans. These years hardened his character, strengthened his hatred for the conquerors, and engendered a burning desire to avenge his humiliation and the fate of his homeland. He learned to hide his true feelings, to be patient, and to bide his time. The constant fear for his life, the lives of his brother and father, as well as a sense of powerlessness in the face of a mighty enemy, probably contributed to the development in him of that mercilessness and suspicion that would become his distinguishing traits. Some historians suggest that Vlad might have been subjected to physical punishment or torture during his captivity, which further embittered him. In 1447, while Vlad and Radu were still hostages, A tragedy occurred in Wallachia. Vlad II Dracula, accused by the Hungarian regent John Hunyadi of treason and collusion with the Ottomans, was overthrown and killed along with his eldest son, Mircea II. Mircea, who had briefly ruled Wallachia with his father's support, was blinded and buried alive by the boyars of Targoviste, who were dissatisfied with his cruel rule. This news, reaching Vlad in the Ottoman Empire, was a terrible blow to him. He had lost his father and brother, and now his own life hung by a thread. However, the Ottomans decided to use him for their own purposes. The death of Vlad II freed them from their obligations to him, and they saw in young Vlad a potential candidate for the Wallachian throne who would be entirely indebted to them for his elevation. In 1448, with the support of Ottoman troops provided by Sultan Murad II, the 17-year-old, or thereabouts, Vlad III, invaded Wallachia and seized the throne, overthrowing Vladislav II, John Hunyadi's protege. This was Vlad's first, very short and unstable reign, lasting only a few months, probably from October to December. The young voivode, lacking strong support within the country and completely dependent on the Ottomans, could not hold on to power. His position was extremely precarious. The boyars, remembering the cruelty of his father and brother Mircea, treated him with suspicion and hostility. The population, tired of constant wars and changes of rulers, did not give him broad support. And most importantly, his main opponent, Vladislav II, enjoyed the support of the powerful John Hunyadi, who could not accept an Ottoman protege on the Wallachian throne. At this time, John Hunyadi was preparing a major crusade against the Ottomans, culminating in the Battle of Kosovo-Polje in October 1448. Vladislav II, as a vassal of the Hungarian king, participated in this campaign. However, the campaign ended in a crushing defeat for the Christian army. Despite this, Hunyadi, upon returning to Hungary, did not abandon his plans to regain control over Wallachia. Taking advantage of Hunyadi's absence, as he was engaged in war with the Ottomans, Vlad III was able to briefly seize power. However, as soon as the situation allowed, Vladislav II, returning from the campaign with the support of Hungarian detachments, easily expelled young Dracula from Wallachia. Vlad had to flee for his life. This first unsuccessful reign became a bitter but important lesson for Vlad. He realized that external support alone was not enough to retain power. He needed his own strength, loyal people, and the support of at least part of the boyars and the population. He also realized that his main enemy was not only the Ottomans, but also those who stood in their way, in this case, the Hungarians and their proteges. His hatred for Vladislav II, his father's murderer, or at least the one responsible for his death, grew even stronger. After his overthrow at the end of 1448, Vlad III Dracula was forced into exile again. A long period of wandering, searching for allies, and accumulating experience began, lasting about 8 years. These years became a time of final formation of his character, the tempering of his will, and the development of the strategy that would later bring him fame and terror. Initially, Vlad found refuge in the Principality of Moldavia, where his uncle, Bogdan II, according to one version on his mother's side, ruled. Relations between Wallachia and Moldavia, as mentioned, were complex, but family ties and the common threat from the Ottomans and Hungary sometimes brought their rulers closer. Vlad spent several years in Moldavia, approximately until 1451, probably participating in the political and military life of the principality, gaining experience in governance and warfare. Here, he may have become close to young Stephen, Bogdan II's son, the future Stephen the Great, who would later become his ally and then his opponent. However, in 1451, Bogdan II was assassinated by his half-brother Petru Aron, and Vlad had to flee again, as the new ruler of Moldavia was hostile towards him. After Moldavia, Vlad went to Transylvania, which was under the rule of the Kingdom of Hungary. This was a bold and risky move, as John Hunyadi was the main patron of Vladislav II, Vlad's sworn enemy. However, the political situation in the region was volatile. Hunyadi, despite his anti-Ottoman stance, was a pragmatic politician and could change his allies and protégés depending on circumstances. Perhaps Vlad hoped that Hunyadi, disappointed with Vladislav II, who had begun to pursue an increasingly independent policy from Hungary and even to draw closer to the Ottomans, would turn his attention to him as an alternative candidate for the Wallachian throne. For some time, Vlad hid in Transylvania, probably in Brasov or Sibiu, cities with which he would later have complex relations. He tried to establish contacts with influential Hungarian and Transylvanian nobles, seeking support for his return to his homeland. His situation was unenviable. An exile, deprived of means and power, pursued by enemies. However, he did not lose heart, but persistently prepared for revenge. It was during this period, apparently, that he met John Hunyadi. The exact circumstances of this meeting are unknown, but according to some accounts, Hunyadi, impressed by young Dracula's determination and military abilities, and dissatisfied with Vladislav II's behavior, decided to back him. Perhaps the fact that Vlad, despite his past Ottoman hostage experience, demonstrated a readiness to fight against the Turks, which corresponded to Hunyadi's main goals, also played a role. The Hungarian regent might have seen him as a more reliable and manageable ally than Vladislav II. Under Hunyadi's patronage, Vlad was given the opportunity to assemble a small army of mercenaries and Wallachian émigrés, dissatisfied with Vladislav II's rule. He also likely received certain political guarantees and financial support from Hunyadi. The years of exile had not been in vain. Vlad had matured, gained military and political experience, and studied his enemies and allies. He was determined to reclaim his father's throne and avenge all humiliations and losses. His heart had hardened, and his methods had become more severe. He understood that in this world the strongest survive, and he was ready to become so. The hour of his triumph, which would simultaneously be the beginning of his bloody legend, was approaching. In the summer of 1456, taking advantage of a favorable political situation, as John Hunyadi was busy preparing for the defense of Belgrade against Mehmed II's huge Ottoman army, Vlad III Dracula, at the head of a small army provided by the Hungarians and Transylvanian Saxons, and with the support of some Wallachian boyars, invaded Wallachia. His main opponent, Voivode Vladislav II, marched out to meet him. In the decisive battle, which occurred, according to some accounts, on July 22, 1456, Vladislav II was defeated and killed. Legend has it that Vlad Dracula personally slew his enemy in single combat, thus avenging the deaths of his father and brother. Thus began the second, most famous, and most bloody reign of Vlad Tepes, which would last 6 years and forever inscribe his name in the annals of history. Upon returning to the throne, Vlad found Wallachia in a deplorable state. Years of internecine strife, frequent changes of rulers, boyar arbitrariness, constant raids by neighbors, and the Ottoman threat had led the country to economic decline and political anarchy. Central authority was weak, boyars felt like absolute masters in their domains, the treasury was empty, and the people suffered from lawlessness and poverty. Vlad faced an extremely difficult task: to restore order, strengthen the state, and ensure its security and independence. And he set about this task with his characteristic energy, determination, and ruthlessness. Vlad considered his first and foremost task to be the strengthening of voivodal power and curbing the willfulness of the boyars, whom he rightly considered the main source of instability in the country. He remembered how boyars had betrayed and killed his father and brother, how they easily changed voivodes, pursuing their selfish interests. Therefore, his policy towards the boyar aristocracy was aimed at weakening and subjugating it. He sought to replace the old, high-born nobility with a new service nobility, indebted to him personally for their advancement. The most famous episode illustrating his methods of dealing with the boyars is the legend of the feast at Targoviste and the construction of Poenari Castle. According to this legend, which has come down to us in several versions, mainly in German pamphlets and Russian tales, Vlad invited the most prominent boyars, implicated in the murder of his father and brother, as well as those who constantly intrigued against him, to an Easter feast. During the feast, he asked them how many voivodes they remembered in their lifetime. When the boyars, boasting of their longevity and influence, began to list many names, Vlad accused them that it was because of their willfulness and betrayals that the country knew no peace. Then, by his order, the old and infirm boyars were immediately impaled in the palace courtyard, and the young and healthy ones, along with their wives and daughters, in their festive clothes, he forced to walk many kilometers into the mountains to the ruins of the old Poenari fortress, and there, without rest or food, under threat of death, to build a new, impregnable castle, which was to become his main residence and symbol of his power. Many died from exhausting labor, but the castle was built in record time. Although this story is probably embellished and dramatized, it reflects the general direction of Vlad's policy towards oppositional boyars. He mercilessly dealt with anyone he suspected of treason or disobedience. Mass executions of boyars and confiscation of their lands and property became commonplace. In their place, he appointed his supporters, often people of non-noble origin, but personally loyal to him. Thus, he created a new elite, the pillar of his power. The purpose of these cruel measures was not only revenge or intimidation, but also the centralization of the state, the creation of a strong, unified authority capable of resisting both internal and external enemies. Vlad sought to transform Wallachia from a fragmented feudal principality into a centralized monarchy where the voivode's will would be law for all. The cruelty of Vlad Tepes became legendary even during his lifetime. His favorite method of punishment, applied to enemies, traitors, criminals, and even simply lazy people or negligent officials, was impalement. This agonizing and humiliating execution, probably borrowed from the Ottomans, was intended not only to take life, but also to instill terror in the hearts of those who might contemplate resistance or disobedience. The stake became the symbol of his rule, his justice, which he administered swiftly, severely, and publicly. Sources of that time, especially German pamphlets that were actively circulated in Europe and created the Black Legend of Dracula, are replete with descriptions of his monstrous atrocities. Many of these stories are undoubtedly exaggerated or outright fabrications, born of the fear and hatred of his enemies, especially the Transylvanian Saxon merchants with whom Vlad had serious conflicts. However, even if we dismiss the most incredible fabrications, there remains sufficient evidence confirming his extreme cruelty. Vlad's philosophy of punishment was simple. Fear is the best guarantor of order and obedience. He believed that only a demonstrative and merciless reprisal against lawbreakers could deter others from crimes and ensure stability in the state. In the conditions of total lawlessness that prevailed in Wallachia before he came to power, such draconian measures may have had a certain effect. Legends tell that during Tepes's reign, one could leave a purse of gold on the road, and no one would dare steal it. So great was the fear of punishment. Numerous accounts of specific instances of Vlad's justice have survived. For example, the story of dishonest merchants whom he burned alive or impaled for cheating customers, or of lazy peasants whom he forced to work under threat of death, or of beggars and vagrants whom, according to one legend, he gathered for a feast and then burned along with the house, stating that he was ridding the country of superfluous mouths and idlers. There are also stories of monks who complained about oppression by boyars. Vlad, having vyjasnil out who was right and who was wrong, punished the guilty, regardless of their rank. Particularly famous is the story of foreign ambassadors, Turkish or Italian according to different versions, who upon entering Vlad's presence did not remove their headgear, be it turbans or hats, as a sign of respect. When Vlad asked them why they had not done so, the ambassadors replied that such was their custom. "Well," said Vlad, "I wish to strengthen your custom," and he ordered their headgear to be nailed to their heads. This story, like many others, was intended to demonstrate his inflexibility, his demand for unconditional obedience and respect for his authority, as well as his dark humor. By creating the image of a just tyrant, Vlad sought to show that his cruelty was not aimed at personal enrichment or satisfying sadistic inclinations, but at the good of the state, at eradicating evil and establishing order. For the common people, tired of the arbitrariness of boyars and robbers, such a ruler, despite his severity, might have seemed a protector and guarantor of justice. Of course, this was justice based on fear, but in those conditions, it was perhaps the only kind possible. It is important to note that the cruelty of Vlad Tepes, although it stood out even against the backdrop of his harsh era, was not something absolutely unique. The Middle Ages and the early modern period knew many rulers who resorted to mass executions and torture to assert their power. However, it was Vlad Dracula who, due to a confluence of circumstances, the activities of his enemies, and subsequent literary tradition, became one of the most vivid and sinister symbols of tyranny and cruelty in world history. His name became a household word, and the stake his eternal attribute. Besides establishing iron order through intimidation and reprisals, Vlad Tepes also carried out certain reforms aimed at strengthening Wallachia's economy and defense capabilities. His domestic policy was subordinated to the main goal, creating a strong, centralized state capable of resisting external threats, primarily the Ottoman Empire. In the economic sphere, Vlad sought to encourage the development of crafts and trade, but at the same time he strictly controlled them. He understood that a prosperous economy was the foundation of a strong state, a source of income for the treasury and the maintenance of the army. He granted certain privileges to local merchants and artisans, protecting them from boyar arbitrariness and foreign competition. At the same time, he demanded from them the strictest observance of laws and honesty in business. Any violations, as mentioned, were punished mercilessly. Vlad paid special attention to relations with Transylvanian cities, primarily Brașov, also known as Kronstadt, and Sibiu, or Hermannstadt, which were important centers of crafts and transit trade between Central Europe and the Balkans. These cities, inhabited mainly by German colonists, Saxons, enjoyed significant privileges and autonomy. Vlad tried to limit their economic influence in Wallachia, protecting the interests of local merchants, which led to frequent conflicts. He demanded that Saxon merchants comply with his established trade rules, introduced customs duties, and in case of disobedience, resorted to punitive measures: arrests, confiscation of goods, executions. It was these conflicts with the Transylvanian Saxons that became one of the main reasons for the appearance and spread in Europe of negative pamphlets about Dracula, portraying him as a bloodthirsty tyrant and an enemy of Christianity. The Saxons, possessing extensive trade connections and access to printing presses, actively shaped public opinion in Germany and other European countries, presenting Vlad in the darkest possible light. Despite these conflicts, Vlad understood the importance of trade with Transylvania and sought to maintain certain relations with it, albeit on his own terms. He also tried to establish trade links with other countries, for example, with Poland and the Genoese colonies in Crimea. An important direction of Vlad's domestic policy was strengthening the army. He understood that without a strong and loyal army, Wallachia could not defend its independence. He reorganized the army, increased its numbers, and introduced strict discipline. The core of his army consisted of viteji, professional warriors who served the voivode for land or pay, as well as a popular militia, convened in case of war. Vlad personally commanded the army, was a brave and talented military leader, skilled at inspiring his soldiers and using various tactical methods, including guerrilla warfare and psychological pressure on the enemy. He also paid attention to the construction and strengthening of fortresses, which were to serve as strongholds for the country's defense. Besides the already mentioned Poenari Castle, his personal citadel, he fortified other strategically important fortresses, such as Targoviste, the capital of the principality, Bucharest, which under him is first mentioned as a voivodal residence and begins to gain increasing importance, and Giurgiu on the Danube. Vlad strove to create a strong, centralized state, relying on a nobility and army loyal to him, with a developed economy and a reliable defense system. His methods were cruel, but his goals, at least in the initial stage of his reign, largely served the country's interests. However, terror, which became the main instrument of his policy, could not but provoke resistance and hatred, both within the country and beyond its borders. This ultimately led to his downfall. From the very beginning of his second reign, Vlad Tepes pursued a policy independent of the Ottoman Empire. Although he came to power with Hungarian support, he had no intention of being a puppet of either the Hungarian king or the Ottoman Sultan. His main goal was to ensure Wallachia's sovereignty, and he was ready to fight for it by any means. For the first few years, from approximately 1456 to 1459, Vlad formally recognized the suzerainty of Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II and even paid him tribute, albeit irregularly and in smaller amounts than his predecessors. This was a necessary measure to buy time, consolidate his power within the country, reorganize the army, and prepare for the inevitable clash with the mighty Porte. He understood that open conflict with the Ottomans at this stage would be suicidal. However, Vlad gradually became more independent and defiant in his relations with the Ottomans. He stopped paying tribute, which included not only money but also the supply of a certain number of young men to replenish the janissary ranks, the so-called devshirme, or blood tax, which was particularly humiliating for the Christian population. He also began to grant asylum to fugitives from Ottoman territories and even to conduct small raids into Ottoman territory south of the Danube. The culmination of this confrontation was the famous episode with the Ottoman envoys, which probably occurred in 1459 or 1460. Sultan Mehmed II, dissatisfied with the Wallachian voivode's behavior, sent envoys to him demanding immediate payment of all tribute arrears and his appearance in Istanbul to submit. The envoys, upon arriving before Vlad in Targoviste, behaved arrogantly and, as mentioned, did not remove their turbans in his presence. Vlad's reaction was swift and brutal. He ordered their turbans to be nailed to their heads, stating that he respected their customs. This act was an open challenge to the Sultan, a demonstration of complete contempt for his authority and readiness for war. According to other versions, Vlad simply refused to comply with the Sultan's demands, and the story with the turbans is a later legend, though very characteristic of Tepes's image. After this incident, or a series of similar provocations, relations between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire deteriorated completely. Mehmed II, occupied with other wars and internal affairs, did not immediately react to the Wallachian vassal's audacity, but it was clear that he would not forgive such humiliation. Vlad, in turn, understood that war was inevitable and began to actively prepare for it. He tried to find allies in Europe to fight against the Ottomans. He appealed for help to the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, son of John Hunyadi, who had died in 1456 from plague after the victory at Belgrade, to Pope Pius II, who was calling for a new crusade, and to other European rulers. In his letters, Vlad presented himself as a defender of Christianity, standing at the forefront of the fight against the infidels. He emphasized that Wallachia was the last bastion against Ottoman expansion into Central Europe, and if it fell, the fate of the entire Christian world would be sealed. However, His appeals did not find a wide response. Europe was torn by internal contradictions, and the idea of a new crusade was not very popular. Hungary, although interested in weakening the Ottomans, was in no hurry to provide Vlad with significant military aid, fearing involvement in a major war. The Pope could offer only moral support and financial subsidies, which were clearly insufficient. Vlad Tepes found himself virtually alone against one of the most powerful empires of the time. But this did not stop him. He decided to play with death, and this game promised to be bloody. Anticipating the inevitable invasion of the Ottoman army, Vlad Tepes decided to launch a preemptive strike. In the winter of 1461 to 1462, during severe frosts, he and his army crossed the frozen Danube and invaded Ottoman territory in northern Bulgaria. This winter raid was marked by exceptional audacity and cruelty. Wallachian detachments advanced rapidly through enemy land, burning towns and villages, exterminating Ottoman garrisons and the local Muslim population. Vlad personally led this campaign, demonstrating his command talents and ruthlessness. In his letter to Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, dated February 11, 1462, he proudly reported his successes, listing the number of enemies killed, by his count over 23,000, not including those who burned in their homes, and attaching 2 bags of severed heads, noses, and ears as proof. This act of intimidation was aimed not only at the Ottomans, but also at European allies, to whom Vlad wanted to demonstrate his determination and military might. Vlad's actions enraged Sultan Mehmed II. The conqueror of Constantinople, unaccustomed to such disobedience and audacity from his vassals, decided to personally lead a punitive expedition against Wallachia and wipe it off the face of the earth. In the spring of 1462, he assembled a huge army, whose numbers, according to various estimates, ranged from 60 to 80,000 to 150 to 200,000 warriors, although the latter figures are probably exaggerated. This was one of the largest armies ever to invade the Balkans. It included elite Janissary regiments, heavy Sipahi cavalry, artillery, and auxiliary troops. In addition, the Sultan had a powerful fleet on the Danube. Against this armada, Vlad Tepes could field no more than 20 to 30,000 warriors, mostly light-armed and lacking the combat experience of the Ottomans. Understanding that he had no chance in open battle, Vlad chose tactics of guerrilla warfare and scorched earth. Retreating into the interior of the country, the Wallachians destroyed everything in their path, burning crops, poisoning wells, driving away livestock, and destroying bridges. They set up ambushes, attacked Ottoman detachments foraging for food or scouting, and wore down the enemy with constant minor skirmishes. Vlad's goal was to prevent the Ottomans from using their numerical superiority, to deprive them of food and water, and to weaken their morale. The culmination of this campaign was the famous night attack near Targoviste, the capital of Wallachia, which took place on the night of June 16th to 17th, 1462. Vlad, disguised in Turkish attire and knowing the Turkish language, thanks to his years as a hostage, personally scouted the Ottoman camp. Then, at the head of an elite detachment of 7,000 to 10,000 warriors, he suddenly attacked the Sultan's camp under cover of night. The aim of the attack was to kill Mehmed II himself, which could have led to panic and the collapse of the Ottoman army. The Wallachians stormed into the camp, sowing death and destruction, but they failed to break through to the Sultan's tent. A fierce battle ensued, lasting several hours. Although they failed to kill the Sultan, the night attack inflicted significant losses on the Ottomans, according to some accounts up to 15,000 men, and caused panic in their ranks. Mehmed II himself, according to eyewitnesses, was shocked by the audacity and bravery of the Wallachians. However, Vlad also suffered heavy losses, about 5,000 killed and wounded, and was forced to retreat. Despite the tactical success of the night attack, Vlad's strategic position remained critical. The Ottoman army, having recovered from the shock, continued its advance on Targoviste. And it was here, on the approaches to his capital, that Vlad employed his most terrifying psychological weapon, the forest of stakes. When the Ottoman troops approached the city, they were confronted with a horrific sight. On a vast field stretching for several kilometers in length and width, thousands of stakes were erected, and on each of them writhed or already lay the corpse of an Ottoman prisoner, captured during the winter raid or subsequent skirmishes. According to various estimates, the number of impaled victims ranged from 10 to 20,000. This was done not only to intimidate the enemy but also to show the Sultan that Vlad would stop at nothing in his struggle. The spectacle was so gruesome that, according to the Ottoman chronicler Kalkokondilas, even Sultan Mehmed II, who had seen much blood and death, was shaken and admitted that he could not conquer a country whose ruler was capable of such an act. He also said that a man who commits such deeds deserves more. However, despite all of Vlad's efforts, the disparity in forces was too great. The Ottoman army, though it had suffered losses and was demoralized, remained a formidable force. Moreover, Mehmed II had another trump card, Vlad's younger brother, Radu Cel-Frumos, Radu the Handsome, who was in the Ottoman camp. The Sultan decided to use him to split Wallachian resistance. Radu, who had converted to Islam and enjoyed the Sultan's favor, was proclaimed the new voivode of Wallachia. He was promised the support of the Ottoman army, and Wallachian boyars who defected to his side were promised pardon and favors. Many boyars, tired of Vlad's cruel rule, his endless wars, and high taxes, and frightened by the might of the Ottoman army, chose to side with Radu, seeing him as the lesser evil and a hope for peace. Vlad found himself isolated. His army dwindled. Fewer and fewer loyal men remained. Realizing that further resistance was futile, he was forced to abandon Targoviste and, with a small detachment of loyal warriors, retreat to Transylvania, hoping to receive help from Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus. Wallachia fell under the rule of Radu the Handsome, who became an Ottoman vassal. The Great War of 1462 ended in Vlad Tepes' defeat. His heroic but desperate resistance could not stop the Ottoman machine. However, his name and his methods of struggle remained forever in the memory of both enemies and posterity. Having fled Wallachia in the autumn of 1462, Vlad Tepes headed to Transylvania, counting on the help of Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, to whom he had previously demonstrated his loyalty and readiness to fight the Ottomans. Vlad hoped that Corvinus, as an ally and suzerain, would provide him with troops to continue the struggle and reclaim the throne. However, his expectations were not met. Instead of help, he received an order for his arrest. The reasons for Vlad's arrest by Matthias Corvinus are still debated among historians. Several versions exist. According to one, Corvinus, though valuing Vlad as a warrior, feared his independent and cruel nature, and also did not want to be drawn into a full-scale war with the Ottoman Empire over the Wallachian voivode. Perhaps he found it more advantageous at that moment to support Radu the Handsome, who, though an Ottoman protege, seemed more predictable and manageable. Another, more common version, links Vlad's arrest to the intrigues of Transylvanian Saxon merchants from Brasov and Sibiu. They, as mentioned, were Tepes' bitterest enemies due to his trade policy and punitive expeditions. Upon learning of his flight to Transylvania, the Saxons presented Matthias Corvinus with fabricated letters, allegedly written by Vlad to Sultan Mehmed II. In these letters, Vlad supposedly offered the Sultan his assistance in conquering Hungary in exchange for restoration to the Wallachian throne. Although the authenticity of these letters is highly doubtful, and they were most likely a skillful forgery, they achieved their goal. Matthias Corvinus, perhaps not fully believing in Vlad's betrayal himself, used these letters as a pretext for his arrest to justify his actions to the Pope and other European rulers, to whom he had previously presented Vlad as a fighter for Christianity, and from whom he had received subsidies for the war against the Turks. By arresting Vlad as a traitor, Corvinus could appropriate these funds for himself. In any case, in November or December of 1462, Vlad Tepes was arrested by order of Matthias Corvinus and imprisoned. Thus began his long period of captivity, which lasted about 12 years. The conditions of his confinement changed over time. Initially, he was probably held in stricter conditions, perhaps in one of the royal fortresses in Transylvania or in Hungary itself. However, gradually, the regime of his confinement softened. He was transferred to Buda, the capital of Hungary, and then to Visegrad, where he was provided with more comfortable conditions, akin to house arrest. He could receive visitors, engage in hunting, and lead a relatively free life, albeit under supervision. It was during this period of captivity, according to some accounts, that Vlad married a member of the Hungarian nobility, possibly a relative of Matthias Corvinus himself. Her name is often mentioned as Ilona or Justina Szilágyi, a cousin of the king. This marriage, if it indeed took place, could have been a political move by Corvinus, seeking to bind the former Wallachian voivode to himself and use him in the future, or it could have been the result of personal affection. From this marriage, according to some reports, Vlad had 2 sons, who later integrated into the Hungarian aristocracy. During his long captivity, Vlad did not lose hope of returning to Wallachia. He closely followed events in his homeland, where the rule of his brother Radu the Handsome, completely dependent on the Ottomans, was unpopular with the population and many boyars. Radu pursued a policy of appeasing the Porte, which caused dissatisfaction among the patriotically minded part of Wallachian society. The struggle for power continued in the country, and Matthias Corvinus possibly kept Vlad in reserve as a potential candidate for the throne, who could be used at an opportune moment. It was during Vlad Tepes' Hungarian captivity that the so-called German pamphlets, or stories about Voivode Dracula, began to actively circulate in Europe. These were small printed brochures, published in Germany, which sensationally and often exaggeratedly described the cruelties and atrocities of the Wallachian ruler. Their authors or commissioners were probably Transylvanian Saxons, taking revenge on Vlad for his policies. These pamphlets, which became a kind of medieval bestseller, played a huge role in forming the black legend of Dracula, presenting him as a monster, a sadist, and an enemy of Christianity. They laid the foundation for the subsequent demonization of his image and his transformation into a vampire in 19th century literature. Meanwhile, the political situation in the region was changing. Radu the Handsome died or was overthrown around 1473 to 1475, and Basarab III Laiota the Old, a representative of the dynasty branch hostile to the Draculists, ascended the Wallachian throne with Ottoman support. Matthias Corvinus, preparing a new campaign against the Ottoman Empire, decided it was time to use Vlad Tepes again. Around 1474 to 1475, Vlad was released from captivity, or his conditions were significantly eased, and he was allowed to return to active political and military life. He was once again considered an ally of Hungary in the fight against the Ottomans and their protégés in Wallachia. 12 years of waiting and humiliation were coming to an end. Vlad Dracula was preparing for his final battle. In 1476, after a hiatus of more than 10 years, Vlad Tepes got a chance to return to the Wallachian throne. Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary, was planning another anti-Ottoman campaign, and saw in Vlad an experienced military commander and a potential ally capable of leading Wallachia and directing its forces against the Porte. With the support of Hungarian troops, as well as detachments from the Moldavian voivode Stephen the Great, Stefan cel Mare, who was Vlad's cousin and longtime ally, though their relations were not always smooth. Vlad invaded Wallachia. His opponent was Basarab III Laiota the Old, an Ottoman protege who had ruled Wallachia since 1473. Basarab Laiota was not very popular in the country, and many boyars were ready to support Vlad's return, hoping for the restoration of independence and order. The military campaign was short, but successful. The combined forces of Vlad, the Hungarians, and the Moldavians defeated Basarab Laiota's troops, and Laiota was forced to flee the country. In November 1476, Vlad Tepes ascended the Wallachian throne for the third time. It seemed that his long wanderings and humiliations were over, and he could once again rule his homeland. However, his third reign proved to be even shorter and more tragic than the first. It lasted only about 2 months, from November to December 1476, or early January 1477. Vlad's position was extremely precarious. Although he had regained the throne, the main part of the troops with which he had come, namely the Hungarians and Moldavians, soon left Wallachia, leaving him with a small personal detachment consisting mainly of mercenaries and a few loyal boyars. The Ottomans, unwilling to accept the loss of control over Wallachia, immediately launched a counteroffensive, supporting Basarab Laiota the Old, who returned with new forces. Vlad found himself virtually alone against superior enemy forces. Many Wallachian boyars, fearing Ottoman vengeance or unwilling to endure Tepes's cruel rule again, did not provide him with adequate support or even defected to the enemy. The circumstances of Vlad Tepes's death are shrouded in mystery and have given rise to numerous versions and legends. The exact date and place of his demise are unknown, but it most likely occurred in late December 1476 or early January 1477, during one of the battles with the Ottomans and Basarab Laiota's troops, somewhere near Bucharest. According to one of the most common versions, Vlad was betrayed by his own boyars and killed during a battle. Perhaps he fell in an unequal fight, fighting to the last. According to another version, he was mistakenly killed by his own soldiers, who mistook him for a Turk due to his Ottoman attire, which he sometimes wore, or due to the fury with which he slew enemies. There is also a version that he was killed by an assassin sent by Basarab Laiota, or even the Ottoman Sultan. Legend has it that after Vlad's death, his head was cut off and preserved in honey, sent to Istanbul as a trophy, and proof of his demise to Sultan Mehmed II. This was meant to symbolize the final Ottoman victory over their implacable enemy. Vlad's body, according to tradition, was found and buried by monks in the Snagov Monastery, located on an island in the middle of a lake, not far from Bucharest. However, this too is not a certain fact. The mystery of Vlad Tepes's grave remains unsolved to this day. Archaeological excavations conducted at Snagov Monastery in the 20th century did not provide a definitive answer. Several burials were discovered, but none can be confidently identified as the grave of Vlad Dracula. One of the graves found, located in front of the altar, which indicates the high status of the deceased, turned out to be empty, giving rise to new legends, including that Vlad did not die but turned into a vampire. Another grave contained the remains of a richly dressed man, but without a head, and objects that could have belonged to Vlad were found nearby. However, even here there is no complete certainty. There are other versions about his burial place, for example, Komana Monastery, founded by Vlad himself. Thus tragically and mysteriously ended the life of one of the most vivid and controversial rulers in the history of Wallachia. His third reign was but a brief glimmer of hope that quickly faded. But his death was not the end of his story. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of his posthumous life in legends, myths, and world culture, where he achieved immortality, albeit in a very sinister guise. The assessment of the personality and activities of Vlad Tepes, or Dracula, still provokes sharp debate among historians and in society. Who was he really? A cruel tyrant, a sadist who reveled in the suffering of his victims, or a stern but just ruler, a defender of his fatherland, fighting for his country's independence under the most difficult conditions? The answer to this question is ambiguous and depends on the perspective from which his deeds are viewed and which sources are taken as a basis. For many Western historians and for the mass consciousness shaped by the influence of the Black Legend and Bram Stoker's novel, Vlad Tepes is, above all, synonymous with extreme cruelty, a medieval monster whose atrocities defy justification. The emphasis is on his sadistic tendencies, mass executions, and impalement as a favorite method of reprisal. His reign is viewed as an era of terror and lawlessness, and he himself as a psychopath who reveled in power and human suffering. However, in Romanian historiography, especially since the 19th century during the period of national revival, the image of Vlad Tepes underwent a significant transformation. He began to be seen as a national hero, a fighter for Wallachia's independence against the Ottoman yoke, a strong ruler who tried to strengthen central authority, establish order in the country, and protect it from external enemies. His cruelty in this context is interpreted as a necessary measure, essential for curbing wayward boyars, combating crime, and intimidating enemies. His military talents, courage, and patriotism are emphasized. He appears as a tragic figure, misunderstood by his contemporaries and slandered by his enemies, but who dedicated his life to serving his homeland. This view of Vlad Tepes is popular in Romania even today, where he is considered one of the outstanding rulers in the country's history, and his name is associated with strength, determination, and the struggle for freedom. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. One cannot deny the facts of Vlad Tepes's extreme cruelty, confirmed by various sources, even if the most obvious exaggerations and fabrications are dismissed. His methods of rule were indeed harsh and merciless, and he bears responsibility for the deaths of thousands of people. However, one cannot ignore the historical context in which he lived and acted. The 15th century was an era of brutal customs, constant wars, political intrigues, and betrayals. Rulers often resorted to violence to assert their power and achieve their goals. Vlad Tepes was no exception, although he perhaps surpassed many of his contemporaries in the scale and ingenuity of his punishments. On the other hand, one cannot deny his merits in strengthening the Wallachian state and fighting for its independence. He did indeed try to centralize power, weaken boyar opposition, establish order in the country, develop the economy, and create a strong army. His struggle against the Ottoman Empire, despite its tragic outcome, was an act of desperate courage and patriotism. He was one of the few European rulers of that time who dared to openly challenge the powerful Sultan Mehmed II. His resistance, though unable to stop Ottoman expansion, inflicted significant damage on the Turks and possibly slowed their advance into Central Europe. Thus, Vlad Tepes is a complex and ambiguous historical figure, combining traits of a cruel tyrant and a selfless patriot, a cunning politician and a valiant warrior. He cannot be unequivocally classified as either a villain or a hero. He was a product of his era, a son of his time, and his actions should be assessed considering all the circumstances and contradictions of that period. His legacy is multifaceted and continues to arouse interest and debate, which testifies to his extraordinary personality and significant influence on the course of history. Our knowledge of the life and reign of Vlad Tepes is based on various historical sources, which can be conditionally divided into several groups. Each of these groups has its own characteristics, its degree of reliability, and its own perspective on the personality and deeds of the Wallachian voivode. A critical analysis of these sources is necessary to try to separate historical truth from fiction and propaganda. The first group consists of Romanian, that is, Wallachian, and Moldavian, annals and chronicles. These sources, as a rule, were created at voivodal courts or in monasteries, and reflected an official or patriotic viewpoint. They generally present Vlad Tepes as a strong and just ruler, fighting against traitorous boyars and external enemies, a defender of orthodoxy and the country's independence. Although they mention his severity, they justify it as necessary for establishing order. Examples of such sources include Grigore Ureche's Chronicle of the Land of Moldavia, or later compilations. However, Romanian sources about Vlad Tepes are quite scarce and fragmentary, especially those directly pertaining to his time. Many of them were written much later and may have undergone ideological editing. The second group comprises Ottoman, or Turkish, chronicles and documents. These sources naturally present Vlad as an enemy of the Ottoman Empire, a rebel, and an infidel who deserved the harshest punishment. They describe his daring attacks on Ottoman territories, his cruelty towards Turkish prisoners, and his resistance to sultanic authority. Examples include the chronicles of authors like Tursun Bey, MehmedII, or later Ottoman historians. Although these sources are biased and hostile towards Vlad, they contain valuable information about his military campaigns, army numbers, and the Ottoman reaction to his actions. They also confirm his reputation as a cruel and dangerous adversary. The third group consists of Hungarian and Transylvanian sources, including royal charters, diplomatic correspondence, and chronicles. These sources are also ambiguous. On the one hand, they may present Vlad as an ally of Hungary in the fight against the Ottomans, especially in Vlad's own letters to Matthias Corvinus, or in documents related to the preparation of anti-Ottoman campaigns. On the other hand, they may also reflect a negative attitude towards him, especially from the Transylvanian Saxons, who, as mentioned, were his enemies. Hungarian sources are also important for understanding the period of his captivity and his relations with King Matthias Corvinus. The fourth, and perhaps most influential in shaping Vlad Tepes's image in Europe, group consists of the so-called German pamphlets, or stories about Voivode Dracula, known in German as Geschichte Draculae Wade. These were short printed brochures, published in Germany in the second half of the 15th to early 16th centuries, which sensationally and often grotesquely described Vlad's alleged atrocities. They told of his sadistic tortures, mass executions, cannibalism, and other horrors. These pamphlets, illustrated with gruesome woodcuts, for example depicting Vlad feasting among impaled victims, were hugely popular with the European public and contributed to the creation of the Black Legend of Dracula. Their authors or commissioners, it is believed, were Transylvanian Saxon merchants, taking revenge on Vlad for his economic policy and punitive raids. Although these pamphlets contain much fiction, exaggeration, and blatant propaganda, they were probably based on some real facts or rumors about Vlad's cruelty, which were greatly amplified and distorted. It was these German pamphlets that became one of the main sources of inspiration for Bram Stoker when creating his famous novel. The fifth group comprises Russian sources, particularly the Tale of Dracula Voivode, probably written in the second half of the 15th century by Fyodor Kurizin, a clerk of the Russian embassy in Hungary. This tale, possibly based on oral stories or the same German pamphlets, also describes Vlad's cruelties, but at the same time presents him as a strong and wise, albeit severe, ruler who fought against injustice and evil. The tale of Dracula was widely circulated in Russia and contributed to the formation of a special, more complex and ambiguous image of the Wallachian voivode in Russian culture. In addition, there are other sources, Byzantine, Italian, Polish, which also contain mentions of Vlad Tepes, his policies, and wars. An analysis of all these diverse and often contradictory sources allows modern historians to form a more complete and objective picture of the life and activities of this extraordinary man, separating historical facts from the myths and legends that have enveloped his name. The transformation of the historical Vlad III Tepes, voivode of Wallachia, into Count Dracula king of vampires, is one of the most astonishing and enigmatic processes in the history of world culture. How did it happen that a real person, albeit known for his cruelty, became the prototype of the most famous blood-sucking monster? A key role in this transformation was played, firstly, by Vlad's very nickname, Dracula. As already mentioned, it derives from his father's nickname, Dracul, associated with the Order of the Dragon, and means son of the dragon. However, in the Romanian language, the word Drac also means devil, which gave the nickname a sinister connotation, especially for those hostile to Vlad. This ambiguity and negative connotation of the word Dracula became the first step on the path to his demonization. Secondly, the aforementioned German pamphlets of the 15th and 16th centuries played an immense role. They not only described Vlad's real or fictitious cruelties, but also imbued them with a supernatural, diabolical character. In these pamphlets, Vlad was portrayed as a spawn of hell, a tyrant reveling in the suffering of his victims, drinking their blood. Although there was no direct accusation of vampirism yet, hints of bloody rituals and sadism were present. These pamphlets, widely circulated in Europe, created a lasting image of Dracula as an embodiment of evil. Thirdly, folklore also played its part. In Balkan and Eastern European folklore, beliefs about vampires, ghouls, and werewolves, the undead who rise from their graves at night to drink the blood of the living, had existed since ancient times. These creatures were often associated with tyrants, villains, sorcerers, or people who died unnatural deaths or were cursed. Although there is no direct evidence that Vlad Tepes was considered a vampire in Wallachia during his lifetime or immediately after his death, his reputation as a cruel ruler and the mysterious circumstances of his death and burial could have contributed to the emergence of such rumors and legends. However, the final transformation of Vlad Dracula into a vampire occurred much later, at the end of the 19th century, thanks to the Irish writer Bram Stoker and his Gothic novel Dracula, published in 1897. Stoker, while working on his novel, studied the history and folklore of Eastern Europe. He came across the name Dracula and information about the cruel 15th-century Wallachian voivode, probably from historical works or the same German pamphlets. He was attracted by this sonorous and sinister name, as well as the historical Dracula's reputation as a tyrant and bloodsucker, in a metaphorical sense. Stoker decided to use this name and some details of Vlad Tepes' biography to create his main character, an aristocratic vampire from Transylvania. It is important to note that Bram Stoker did not aim to write a historical novel about Vlad Tepes. He merely borrowed his name, some character traits, such as imperiousness, cruelty, military talents, and certain biographical facts, for example, the fight against the Turks and Transylvanian origins, although the historical Vlad was voivode of Wallachia, and Transylvania was more likely his birthplace and temporary residence. Stoker's main source of inspiration was still vampire folklore, not historical chronicles. He created an entirely new literary image of Count Dracula, which had only a distant connection to its real prototype. Nevertheless, the success of Stoker's novel was overwhelming. Count Dracula became the archetypal vampire, a symbol of evil, temptation, and immortality. And thanks to this novel, the name of the historical Vlad Tepes became forever linked with the world of vampires. A literary image was superimposed on a historical personality, and for many people around the world, Vlad Dracula and the Vampire Count became virtually synonymous. Thus, the birth of Dracula the Vampire is a complex process in which historical facts, folklore beliefs, propaganda, literary fiction, and random coincidences intertwined. The historical Vlad Tepes was not a vampire in the literal sense of the word, but his nickname, his reputation, and Bram Stoker's creative imagination transformed him into the most famous bloodsucker in the history of world culture. This transformation is a vivid example of how history and myth can interact, creating new, unexpected, and extremely enduring images. The image of Vlad Tepes, both as a historical figure and his literary alter ego Count Dracula, has had an immense influence on world culture, especially on literature, cinema, music, and the gaming industry. This influence is multifaceted and contradictory, reflecting various interpretations of his complex figure. In literature, after Bram Stoker, countless works dedicated to vampires have appeared, and many of them refer in one way or another to the image of Dracula. Some authors tried to rethink Stoker's character, giving him greater depth, tragedy, or even romanticism. Others created entirely new vampire images, but the shadow of Dracula was invisibly present over them as well. There are also works that attempt to return to the historical Vlad Tepes, to explore his real life and reign, and to separate him from the vampire myth. Examples include historical novels, biographies, and scholarly research. Cinema, perhaps, has made the greatest contribution to popularizing and visualizing the image of Dracula. Starting with F.W. Murnau's silent film, Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, filmed in 1922, which was a loose adaptation of Stoker's novel with names changed due to copyright issues, and ending with countless Hollywood and European films, Count Dracula has become one of the most recognizable and frequently adapted characters in cinema history. He has been played by such famous actors as Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, Gary Oldman, Frank Langella, and many others. Each of them brought something of their own to the image, creating its various hypostases, from an elegant aristocratic seducer to a monstrous beast or a tragic anti-hero. There are also films that attempt to tell the story of the historical Vlad Tepes, for example, the Romanian film Vlad Tepes. From 1979, directed by Doru Năstase, or the American Dracula Untold, from 2014, directed by Gary Shore, although the latter also heavily mixes history with fantasy. In music, the image of Dracula has also found its reflection. There are operas, musicals, and symphonic works dedicated to him. Many rock and metal bands use vampire themes and the image of Dracula in their songs and albums, attracting listeners with an atmosphere of mysticism, horror, and rebellion. In the gaming industry, Dracula and vampires are also popular characters. There are numerous computer and board games where players are invited to fight Dracula, become him, or explore worlds inhabited by vampires. The Castlevania game series, for example, is largely based on the confrontation between the Belmont clan of vampire hunters and Count Dracula. Furthermore, the image of Vlad Tepes and the Dracula myth are actively used in Romania's tourism industry. Bran Castle in Transylvania, although the historical Vlad most likely never lived there, perhaps only stopping briefly, is advertised as Dracula's Castle and attracts millions of tourists from around the world. The city of Sighișoara, where Vlad was supposedly born, and Snagov Monastery, where he is legendarily buried, are also popular tourist destinations. This exploitation of the myth, on the one hand, promotes tourism and popularizes Romanian history and culture, but on the other hand, often leads to the distortion of historical facts and their confusion with fiction. Thus, Vlad Tepes, the historical figure of the 15th century, and Count Dracula, the literary character of the 19th century, have merged into a single, multifaceted, and extremely influential cultural phenomenon. His image continues to stir people's minds, inspire artists, writers, and directors, and provoke disputes and discussions. He has become a symbol not only of cruelty and horror, but also of tragic destiny, the struggle for power, immortality, and the eternal confrontation between good and evil. The diversity of interpretations of his image testifies to its complexity and enduring relevance for world culture. We have traveled a long and winding path, following the bloody trail of Vlad III Tepes, voivode of Wallachia, nicknamed Dracula by his contemporaries and the Impaler by posterity. From the dark forests of Transylvania, where he perhaps first saw the light, through the halls of Ottoman palaces, where the young hostage absorbed lessons of cruelty and survival, to the battlefields where he desperately fought for a patch of his native land, and finally to the misty shores of Lake Snagov, where, according to legend, his severed head found its final resting place, but not his indomitable spirit. Let us recall the sinister picture with which our story began. The forest of stakes before the walls of Targoviste, a silent and terrifying response to the invasion of the mighty Sultan. This image, born of despair and ruthlessness, became the quintessence of Vlad's reign, a reign based on fear, but pursuing, at least in his own understanding, high goals: the unity of the country, independence from foreign invaders, and justice, albeit harsh, for his people. Was he a monster who reveled in blood and suffering, or a tragic figure forced to resort to extreme measures in an era when other methods did not work? History does not provide a definitive answer, leaving room for interpretations, disputes, and legends. Vlad Tepes was not alone in his cruelty. His age knew many tyrants whose hands were stained with blood. However, it was his name, his nickname Dracula, son of the dragon, or son of the devil, that was charged with a special dark energy, which, having passed through the centuries, transformed into something entirely different, giving birth to one of the most powerful and captivating myths of world culture: the myth of the vampire. The historical voivode, defender of Christianity against the Ottoman threat, paradoxically turned into the king of the undead, the eternal enemy of all living things. The phenomenon of Vlad Tepes makes one ponder many things: about the nature of power and what a person is willing to do to obtain and retain it, about the price of independence and the sacrifices made on its altar, about the fine line between justice and terror, between heroism and villainy, about how easily history turns into myth and a real person into a symbol, living its own life, far removed from the original prototype. Vlad Tepes undoubtedly occupies his place in the pantheon of great and terrible rulers of world history. His deeds, however controversial, left a deep mark on the fate of his country and the entire region. His struggle against the Ottoman Empire, though ending in defeat, became an example of desperate resistance and entered the national epic of the Romanian people. The lessons of his era are relevant even today. In a world where tyranny, violence, and struggles for power and resources still exist, where information manipulation and the creation of black legends remain effective political tools, the story of Vlad Tepes reminds us how important it is to critically examine the past, to separate facts from fiction, to understand motives and context so as not to repeat mistakes and not to succumb to the allure of simple answers to complex questions. The indelible line between historical truth and the power of myth. This, perhaps, is the main legacy of Vlad Dracula. His real life was full of drama, cruelty, and struggle, but his posthumous life in legends proved even more eventful and enduring. He became immortal not only as a historical figure, but also as a cultural archetype, eternally balancing on the edge between light and darkness, between the human and the demonic. The memory of Vlad Tepes, intertwined with fiction and fantasy, continues to live and stir minds. The dragon, the symbol of his lineage and his nickname, has spread its wings over the centuries, and its shadow still excites our imagination, reminding us that history is not just dry facts and dates, but an eternal search for meaning, an eternal struggle for the human soul and its place in the world. And as long as there is interest in the mysteries of the past, in complex and contradictory personalities, in the eternal questions of good and evil, the name of Vlad Dracula will resound, evoking simultaneously horror, admiration, and endless disputes. Thank you for your attention to this long and, I hope, engaging narrative. If the story of Vlad Tepes and his era has interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, give it a like, and share this video with your friends. In the comments, you can ask your questions or suggest topics for future stories. Until new meetings in the world of history.